This is a shir on Likutei Sichos, 28th Chelek, 29th Chelek Chavtes, and the Sikha of Reeh, the second Sikha. So today we're going to deal with something very, very basic. It starts off in the words of the parsha that says, Lo tuchal lechol b'sha'arecha. You will not be able to eat in your gates. In other words, outside Yerushalayim. Yerushalayim are the gates of Hashem. Your gates, in other words, your cities outside Jerusalem, you will not be able to eat in your gates. The tithing of your grains and of your oil and of your grapes and of your oil. In other words, the second Maisa, the second tithing, required that the grains and the fruits, oil and wine, would be brought up and only eaten in the city of Yerushalayim. So you can't eat them in your gates, in your city, you've got to bring it to Yerushalayim. Also, the firstborn of your cattle and your sheep, also they have to be brought up to Yerushalayim, they become a sacrifice. And all the various vows that you've made to bring up to Yerushalayim, and also the bikurim, the first fruits, all of those things require the city of Yerushalayim. You cannot eat them in your own gates. So Rashi quotes the words "lo tuchal," you cannot, and after Rashi says that this pasuk comes liten lo ta'aseh ladavar. These words are still seem to be very very nondescript words, but they will become the basis of the answer. So Rashi says, you cannot eat in your gates all these items that require Yerushalayim. And Rashi says that the reason the Torah says you cannot is because Hashem, the pasuk comes to place a negative commandment on the matter. In other words, rather than saying you must eat these things in Yerushalayim, the Torah said it in a negative way, you may not eat these things in your gates, rather Yerushalayim. So then Rashi again quotes these words, Lo tuchal, you are not able, and he says that Rabbi Yeshua ben Karcha says, Yacholata, you are able, aval ein charashai, you're not allowed. So just to give you context, imagine somebody says to their kid, you're not able to eat a milk ice cream because you've just eaten meat. And the kid turns around and says, I'm not able? And God forbid, a rebellious kid may say, I'm not able, just watch. No. I know you're able. You're not allowed. So Rabbi Yeshua ben Karcha says, the pasuk says, you're not able to eat in your gates these things that require Yerushalayim. Rabbi Yeshua ben Karcha says, you're able. The Torah doesn't mean you're not able. There's no invisible magnetic field that when you try and bring up these things that require Yerushalayim and you're in your own city somewhere else, and you try and bring it up and it just doesn't go. No. You're able, but you're not allowed. And similarly, the Rashi brings a proof that we find that when they came up to Yerushalayim, it says that the Yevusites, the Jebusites, they weren't able to conquer. And there Rashi says, what do you mean they weren't able to? They were able to, they weren't allowed to, as we're going to discuss, because of a promise that had been made with Avraham and so on. So Rashi seems to be addressing the fact when the pasuk says you're not able to do this and this because it's prohibited. No, it doesn't mean you're not able. You're not allowed. So we have to understand. I mean, this is the fifth book of the Torah, it's the book of Devarim. This concept that lo tuchal, you're not able, means really you're not allowed. We've seen before in Chumash. In the book of Shmos, it says, when the people are told not to go up on the mountain of Sinai, it says the people, lo yuchal ha'am la'alot, the people are not able to go on the mountain of Sinai. Because you've told us that the mountain has to be cordoned off, has to be kept holy. And Rashi there says, I don't have to tell them anymore. Hashem, you're telling me, tell the people they can't go up? I've told them already. They know they can't go up. She'ein lahem reshut, they know they have no permission. In other words, obviously they're able, but they know they can't because they're not allowed. Similarly, when the pasuk says, Lo tuchal lirot et panai, you're not able to see my face, says Hashem to Moshe. Rashi comments there, Eini noten lecha reshut, I don't give you permission to see my face. Maybe you're able, but I won't allow it. So square bracket says the Rebbe, this question, in other words, the first question is why in the fifth book of the Torah we've already met this concept. When it says you're not able, it means you're not allowed. Besides for the other question in that you find in further psukim also, and several negative commandments, which are said also in that same language. Lo tuchal lizboach et hapasach, you're not able to bring up the Paschal offering just in one of your cities. And in the next portion of Shoftim, it says, you're not allowed to put upon yourself a king who's doesn't have the right pedigree. And in Parshas Teitz, it says, if you have two wives and one you hate and one you love, and the one you hate had the firstborn, you're not allowed to make the firstborn from the one you love overriding the one that was born first from the woman you hate. When you see a lost object, you're not allowed to, you're not able. All these psukim, it says you're not able. You're not able to bring the offering of Pesach in another city. You're not able to place upon yourself a foreign king. You're not able to choose one son to be the firstborn. You're not able to not notice a lost object, and so on. So there's many cases where the Torah just says you're not allowed, but it uses that language, you're not able. So the question is, why from all the psukim, where the Torah says, interchanges this concept and uses you're not able, meaning because Hashem has said you're not able, Hashem says you're not allowed, so that means you're not able. It doesn't mean you're not physically able. Why of all places does Rashi comment in the fifth book of the Torah, this pasuk, on this topic? And then the question is, why does he bring Rabbi Shua ben Karcha? It sounds like it's a big chiddush. There's some big news going on here. Hello. The whole Torah has to be read in that context. We have it all over the place. You're not able means you're not allowed, because Hashem said you're not able. More than that, the proof that the lashon, that the expression lo tuchal, you're not able, can also mean you're not allowed. We've just brought so many other verses where we see that the context requires us to say lo tuchal doesn't mean you're not able, it means you're not allowed. Why does Rashi go and bring a verse from the Navi which says that they weren't able to drive out the Yevusites, and there it means they're not able because they're not allowed? You need a pasuk in the prophets to prove that lo tuchal, not able, means not allowed. And the question is even greater. Almost this same concept like in our Rashi says when Moshe Rabbeinu says those same words, he says lo uchal od latzet v'lavo, in close to the end of the Torah, where Moshe Rabbeinu is giving his final speech, he says, I become 120 years old today. I'm no longer able to go out and come in. Says Rashi, Yachol shetashash kocho, you think maybe he got weak and physically he's unable. Elderly people sometimes can't go, they can't get around, they don't have mobility. He says, no, that's not. It says about Moshe Rabbeinu that he was young and fresh till the end of his life. What does it mean? I'm not able. Eini rashai. Moshe is saying I'm not allowed. Shenitala mimeni harashut. The permission was taken from me, or maybe harashut here means leadership. I'm not sure. V'nitanali Yoshua. It was given to Yoshua. So Rashi could have brought a example from this very descriptive verse in the Chumash without going to the prophets. And there himself, Rashi pointed out this same concept that the pasuk must be read, that I'm not allowed to continue to lead you anymore, not that I'm not able, because there's a verse that says that Moshe Rabbeinu, at the day that he passed, his eyes were not dimmed and his strength was not diminished. So it must mean when he says I'm not able, he says I'm not allowed. So that's a great pasuk Rashi could have brought, a parallel pasuk. Don't go to the prophets. Why bring a pasuk from Navi? Also, we have to understand, the way of Rashi is to right away comment the first time this question comes up in the Torah. So, in other words, Rashi, when he comments, usually doesn't say the question he's addressing. In other words, where it says lo tuchal, you're not able to eat these things in your cities. The simplest thing that Rashi, usually following the usual style of Rashi, would be not to ask, what do you mean you're not able? You're not able? No, it means you're not allowed. Usually Rashi would just explain the word, you're not able, which means you're not allowed. Rashi doesn't do a lot of questions and answers. When you learn Rashi, a lot of what Rashi is explaining, You then go back and say, what question was Rashi answering? And the wise 5-year-old, or when Rashi is explaining a verse, it means that you wouldn't understand it without his explanation, which means he could have learned another way. What he's answering something there. Here, why does he? But he doesn't usually bring the question. Here he brings, but you're not able. Of course you're able. You're not allowed. Why does he go there to the question? I mean, even though you will say, well, that's the way Rabbi Yehoshua ben Karcha said it, and Rashi's just quoting Rabbi Yehoshua ben Karcha. But many times Rashi just quotes the content without quoting verbatim the way they said it. And more than that, why even bring who said it? Most places Rashi's not saying stuff himself. Rashi's quoting from our sages. Usually he doesn't bring a quote with a name. When he does bring a name, it's got to add something to his interpretation. It gives you a context. What context does telling us that Rabbi Yehoshua ben Karcha was the one who said this, what does that add? So these are all questions on this innocent seeming Rashi. But to me, the greatest excitement is that the Rebbe is going to address the concept of what does the Torah mean when it says you're not able. You are able. And why does the Torah only say you're not able on some instances? If when Hashem says you're not allowed, it always means you're not able, so always say it like that. But not always does the Torah use that language. So we're going to take a in-depth look here. Paragraph 2. Later in the example, Rashi at length explains that similarly you find by the Yevusites who were dwellers of Yerushalayim, so the children of Yehuda were not able to dispossess them, were not able to drive them out. Says Rashi, that pasuk that says the Bnei Yehuda were not able to drive them out, says Rashi, they were able. Not that they had some kind of a weapon, they weren't able to touch them. No, they were able. They were not allowed. Because Avraham, our ancestor, made a covenant. When he bought the cave, the double cave for burial, he made a covenant that he's not make peace with them. So Rashi asked, but that was Hittites, not Yevusites. Al Shem Ha'ir Sheshmo Yevus. These guys were also Hittites. They had another name of Yevusites because the name of the city was Yevus. So is explained in the Medrash called Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer, the chapters of Rabbi Eliezer. And this is what is meant in the verse that says in Shmuel Beis, it says, Ki'im hasircha you can only dispossess them when you get rid of the tablets upon which the oath is recorded. Okay? We're going to unpack this whole concept. Now, the source of this example about the Yevusites not being able to be driven out by the Jews because of some covenant is the statement of Rabbi Yehoshua ben Karcha in the Medrash called Sifri. But there it doesn't say it in great length. There it says, similarly, the same way that Rabbi Yehoshua ben Karcha says, you're not able to eat in your gates these tithes, the second tithe. Similarly, it doesn't mean you're not able, it means you're not allowed. Similarly, when it says in the pasuk that the Yevusites who lived in Yerushalayim, the Bnei Yehuda were not able to uproot them, it doesn't mean they weren't able. They were able, they weren't allowed. So just very simple, very, very brief. Rashi brings a whole long situation. So we can understand why Rashi doesn't just bring the brief excerpt, because Rashi wants to explain to the 5-year-old why Taka were the Yevusites not able to be driven out, because they're not allowed. Why not allowed? So to answer the 5-year-old who didn't learn Navi, why they're not allowed, he says the reason Bnei Yehuda weren't allowed to conquer Yerushalayim just like that is because Avraham Avinu made a covenant with them that he's not going to conquer the city of the Yevusites. And then we have to explain, one second, that the covenant of Avraham, we never find the word Yevus. It's with Hittites. Okay, they were Hittites, but the name of the city was Yevus, so they were Yevusites as well. But we have to understand why Rashi brings the longer version. But what we do have to understand is, why does Rashi learn that this oath was when Avraham bought the the cave. It's not at all, you've learned Chumash, right? You didn't notice it in the Chumash. It's only brought, the whole source of this is in the Medrash called Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer. There is an oath that we do know about in the Chumash. What's the oath with Avimelech? Why doesn't just Rashi say that there was, the Yevusites come from Avimelech, and there was a pact, that very clearly documented pact that is said in the Torah that Avraham Avinu made with Avimelech, the forefather of the Yevusites, that I'm not going to attack not you, not your grandchildren, not your great grandchildren. Why doesn't Rashi say they weren't able to conquer the city of the Yevusites because there was a pact with Avimelech, their ancestor? The question is even more. Rashi on the pasuk in prophets, in Yeshua and in Shoftim, where it says that the children of Yehuda were not able to drive out the Yevusites, you know what he says? They were not allowed because of the oath that Avraham Avinu had promised Avimelech. Wow. So why here doesn't Rashi bring that that's the basis, that they weren't allowed to conquer Yerushalayim? Now, in a Ha'ara, in a footnote 26, it never says, well, you could say the reason Rashi doesn't go with that promise. Who was the promise to? The promise was between Avraham and Avimelech and his grandchild, his child and grandchild. And child and grandchild, Rashi commented already in the verse in Vayera. Why doesn't he say further descendants? He says because a father worries till the grandchildren level. And he's making a pact. He's making it as far as his concerns are. It goes to the level of his children, his grandchildren. So can it be that that oath is still relevant? So if you learn, like Rashi said, that that oath binds them still in the time of Yeshua, it must mean that there was still a grandchild that was still alive. You imagine how many years they would have to be alive? They would have to be alive hundreds of years. So in Rashi, in our parsha, Rashi is speaking in the Torah. In the Torah, Rashi speaks to the 5-year-old. To the 5-year-old, you have to create now a miracle. If you say that, you want to quote the story that they weren't able to conquer Yerushalayim because of the Yevusites' connection to Avimelech, you're going to be instilling into the 5-year-old a new miracle that's created, that the grandchildren of Avimelech lived hundreds of years. There's no need for that. We could say it's based on something else that Rabbi Eliezer taught us, Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer taught us, that there was another pact that took place when Avraham bought the cave. Now, the fact that Rashi does bring in his interpretation of the Navi, in the Pasuk and the Prophets, Rashi brings that the reason they couldn't drive out the Yevusites was because of Avimelech's pact, which again, as we said, will mean, it was only made to the level of grandchildren. It would mean that Avimelech must have had grandchildren that lived extraordinarily long, miraculously long. Here the Rebbe gives us another lesson. For the 5-year-old, Rashi comes to say, just tries always to stick as possible, most as possible, to pshutei shel mikra, to the simple meaning of the pasuk. Whereas when it comes to Navi, Rashi is speaking to a slightly more, he speaks on a higher level of intelligence. Rashi is not so bound just to simple pshat. So here, there's a virtue, there's a benefit to talk about the pact of Avimelech as being the reason they couldn't drive out the Yevusites, because it's in the open in the pasuk. Even though you have to create, or you have to understand from that there was a miraculously long lifespan for his grandchild. In the Navi, Rashi goes with that one. In the pasuk, we understand why Rashi is going with this narrative. However, we still want to understand: is that really the reason? We may answer that. That could be an answer, but the Rebbe is going to give another answer that answers this as well. Pasuk 4. Another item, we have a question. What's the difference? What's the difference? Why does Rashi add the additional verse at the end? In other words, Rashi said the reason that it says they weren't able to drive out the Yevusites, Rashi says not that they weren't able, they weren't allowed. Okay. And then he says, and this is, Rashi adds something that the Sifri doesn't bring, which is, and this is what it says in the verse, only when you get rid of the items of the places, the things upon which the oath is recorded. What's that got to do with our pasuk here? Rashi's not coming to explain what it means there. that they can only take the city of Yerushalayim when they get rid of the recorded oath. And okay, so it's not that's not brought in the Sifri, it's brought in the Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer, but what does that add? Why is he also telling us where he's quoting from? Usually, Rashi is full of quotes from our sages. He doesn't tell us which medrash he's bringing from very often. And if you do want to tell us you're taking it from a medrash, from the words of our sages, because as we said, this pact with the people of Ches when he bought the double cave is not recorded in our psukim. So that's why he wants to quote where he's taking it from. He could have just said, our sages say. Very often Rashi says, our sages, Rabbi Seinu, our sages say this and this. Why quote both two things? He's quoting Rabbi Yeshua ben Karcha, and he's telling us, which actually Rabbi Yeshua ben Karcha's words are coming from the Sifri. Rashi doesn't tell us it's coming from the Sifri. But when he's bringing something here from Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer, something that seemingly he didn't even have to bring, brought an expanded version, and he quotes his source. Why? So some of these questions will seem a little bit more pedantic, a little more detail-oriented, but the basic question still remains, why of all places does Rashi choose to explain lo tuchal, you're not able, as meaning you're not allowed, when that's obvious in many places in the Torah, but wasn't explained till now, or it was explained till now, but why did it need to be explained again here? So we could say the explanation of all this as follows. Paragraph 3. When you learn the pshat, when you learn the simple reading, it makes sense to say that when the Torah uses the language you're not able, even though obviously it doesn't mean you're not able, there's nothing stopping you. It means you're not allowed. The fact that the Torah uses that language is only when that language does not negate the simple reading of you're not able. Again, it's not that using this language, lo tuchal, you're not able, is automatically interchangeable with you're not allowed. Because it's simpler to say you're not allowed. When he says you're not able, even though it means you're not allowed, but it must mean that there's some room to say you're not able as well. What do we mean? In other words, not that you're not able because say, your hands are not going to move. But Hashem says, I'm not going to let you do it. No. Sorry, 1 second. Das heißt, nicht der Pshat, das Durchnehmen, was der Tere asset ihm zu tun, die Sache, wird bei ihm weggenommen in der Möglichkeit, das zu tun. It's not Pshat that through the fact that the Torah forbids it, so now we consider it, whenever something is forbidden, we will consider it unable. If that's the case, so in all prohibitions of the Torah, it's the same thing. Whenever Hashem says you're not allowed, it means you're not able. So why doesn't the Torah always say, why don't all the 365 negative commandments always use the language, you're not able? So obviously, when it's not used across the board, it means that we're not trying to say that when Hashem says you're not permitted, it automatically means you're not able. A Jew is not able to do something Hashem said you're not allowed to do. No, that's not what we're saying. Some places the Torah is saying you're not able because there's an additional nuance here that can be used for those things to be saying not able. How? What this still sounds a little airy. So the Rebbe gives a few examples. For example, it could be it's something that after the Torah forbids it, you can no longer achieve the thing. For example, we gave the example of a person's married to 2 wives. One he loves, one he hates. And the wife he hates had his firstborn. Now, when it comes to inheritance, when it comes to a pidyon haben, relieving of the firstborn, that's the first opening of the womb. So both kids will have a redemption of the first one. When we talk about who's going to get the double portion of inheritance, now you know what he wants to do. He wants to give the double portion to the firstborn from the mother that he loves. But his firstborn is actually from the mother he doesn't like. So the Torah says you're not able to make the firstborn the one that comes from the mother you love. In other words, even if you choose to do that, you're not able. It doesn't happen. When we go to a when we go to an arbiter of truth, he is not the firstborn for inheritance. When there's another place in the Torah, later on, which says that if a person, God forbid, uh, uh, had intimacy with a woman that he took against her will, so it says he has to marry her, and he cannot send her away ever, cannot divorce her. What do you mean he cannot? Yes, because even if he does, he has to get married to her. He's not allowed to. That separation from her is not something that he's able to do. In other words, even if he does, it doesn't hold. He has to right away, he has an obligation to marry her again. So in other words, when we say lo tuchal, you're not able, it could be that the Torah is saying that thing will not stick. It will not happen. You can't do it. Because the Torah says you're not allowed to, and it also says it's not going to work. Or it could be something that's not dependent on the person himself. Like when Hashem tells Moshe, you cannot see my face, for man cannot see me and live. What is that saying? You cannot see because I'm not going to allow you. Even if you want, a person cannot see me and live, so you're not able. Or you're not allowed to put for yourself a king that's not from a pedigreed Jewish family. You know what? Well, you were able, you're just not allowed. No, no, no. The Torah says that when the king sits on his throne, he has to write a book of the Torah. It has to be, and he has to live by the Torah. He has to keep all the Torah, which means to say it's impossible that somebody can maintain the position of king and be not in consistence with what the Torah says. Similarly, when it says by Moshe, Moshe says, I'm not able to come in and go out. We said he's able because he still had his strength, but he's not allowed. He's not able because it's not in his hands to do. Since the leadership was taken from Moshe and given to Yeshua, so indeed, Moshe is not able, he's physically able, but he's not able conceptually to make that choice about whether he goes in and goes out because Hashem has already given it to Yeshua. So the language not able fits here. It's not just not allowed. It's not able because it's something has been done that the choice is not really by you anymore. Or another option when the language not able would fit is when a person has already been told earlier, you're not allowed to do this. Then you can say, you're not able to do this afterwards. For example, when Moshe Rabbeinu told the people, when Hashem says to Moshe, tell the people, you're not allowed to go up on the mountain, Hashem says, no, the people are not able to go up to the mountain already because you already have told them, cordon off the mountain. As Rashi says, they're already warned. So in other words, let's put it into our language. If I've already taught my kid that you're not allowed to eat a milchik ice cream after you've eaten meat, he knows it already. So then I can tell him, you're not able to do that. Because if you haven't taught him that halacha, imagine you have somebody that never heard about the laws of kashrus, and he comes to your house and you gave him a beautiful cholent on Shabbos, and it's got a piece of meat in there, and then he remembers you said feel at home, and he remembered that in the morning you gave him a piece of cheesecake. And you told him feel at home, and an hour later he decides he wants to have a coffee and a piece of cheesecake. He opens your fridge, takes the cheesecake, and you scream, "No, you're not able to do that." Like, you mean not able? You told me feel at home, open the fridge. I'm able. If you told him in advance you're not allowed to, then you can say you're not able. So when the Torah says, one of the examples we gave, you're not able to offer up the Paschal offering in one of your cities. You have to come to Yerushalayim. You know why you're not able? Because first of all, you're not able because you need a kohen to be part of that. A kohen is not going to go along with your shenanigans to come to Yerushalayim, right? A kohen knows you're not allowed to bring up a korban outside the parameters of Yerushalayim, the Beis Hamikdash. But also because the Jew himself has been told that you need to bring your sacrifices only to the place which Hashem chose, Yerushalayim. So now when the Torah says it a second time, you can say, you're not allowed, you're not able. You're not able because Hashem has already told you you're not allowed. Similarly, when we say about a lost object, you're not allowed, you're not able to pretend you didn't see it, that's because there's the previous part of the pasuk, the previous part of this chapter about lost object says, you shall not see somebody else's lost animal and pretend you didn't see it. So the Torah said you're not allowed. Then the Torah said, as he carries on, I've already told you you're not allowed. The Torah can now resort to a language that says you're not able to. You're not able to because I've told you you're not allowed. So this is incredible because based on this, you remember that based on this, let's go to paragraph 4. We'll understand what the pasuk says. You're not able. The pasuk we started off with, which Rashi commented on, where Rashi says you're not able to eat in your gates. The second tithing. 1 second. It hasn't yet said that you're not allowed to eat the tithing and the firstborn of your animal in your gates, and it has to come to Yerushalayim. The only thing it has said already is you're not allowed to offer up sacrifices outside Yerushalayim. But it hasn't said that the second tithing and so on cannot be eaten outside Yerushalayim, which means that this is the first time the Torah is telling us this law, that your second tithing cannot be eaten outside Yerushalayim. So why does it say it in the language you're not able? You're not able? The Torah means to say you're not able, it really means you're not allowed. But why does the Torah say it in that way? So that's why Rashi says that it doesn't mean you're not able. It's not like in all the other cases till now where we've said you're not able, we understand why that language was used. Because in the simplest, the last point that I've made is if the Torah already says you're not allowed, the second time you can say you're not able because you already know you're not allowed. But here it's not been said before. So what do you mean you're not able? So Rashi says, no, here also it means you're not allowed. But, so 1 second. If that's the case, then 1 second. Rashi brings a proof. What does Rashi bring a proof that not able can mean not allowed? From the story that it says in the prophets that the children of Yehuda were not able to drive out the Yevusites from Yerushalayim. Rashi says not that they weren't able, they weren't allowed. But there, it's not that the pasuk says you're not allowed. There's not the Torah is not saying here a new prohibition you're not allowed. The Torah is saying you're not able because you already have something holding you back. There's an oath. In other words, the proof from Yevusites that it means you're not able, means you're not allowed, doesn't fit when the Torah says a prohibition for the first time. There it's not that not allowed is not that not able is not based on a new prohibition now that Hashem's saying you're not able when he really means to say you're not allowed. No, Hashem's saying you're not able because there's a previous prohibition. There's an oath. How is Rashi bringing that to prove that in our verse, which is the first time that the Torah is telling us you're not allowed to eat your second tithing in your own cities, that's coming Yerushalayim, and it uses the language you're not able, and Rashi says, well, that means you're not allowed. But that's not similar to the proof he's bringing if you're not able to conquer the Yevusites. Because they're not able is because there's a previous prohibition. Here, when the Torah uses the language you're not able, but why not? There's no previous prohibition. So Rashi has to say, no, it means you're not allowed. But number two, the question is, even though Rashi says that, even though we're trying to say that this is an unusual, you're not allowed, you're not able, because it has not yet been said that you're not allowed to eat the second tithing outside Yerushalayim. But let's be honest. There has already been an instruction that you must eat the second tithing in Yerushalayim. It hasn't been said in the language of you're not allowed to eat it outside, but it has been said that you needed to eat it inside Yerushalayim. So the question is that maybe the language here, you're not able, is not so different than in the other places. Maybe it is a kind of a second instruction. Maybe because it's said that you have to eat the stuff in Yerushalayim, we can kind of say that the prohibition is implicit. And now when it says you're not able, maybe it does very simply mean you're not able because I've already told you have to eat Yerushalayim. So why would Rashi comment here? Why is it different than any of the other you're not able, which is, as we said, a second time you say something, you can use language you're not able because the prohibition has already been said, you're not allowed. And now once you're not allowed, you're not able. Question number 3, since lo tuchal, the word lo tuchal, really fits for every prohibition. So why sometimes does the Torah say you're not able, and sometimes it doesn't? Why does it say it dafke here? Why at this prohibition of not able to eat your second tithing out Shalim does it use this language, you're not able? So now let's understand paragraph 5. And this is where we mentioned the almost overlooked words of Rashi, which actually give us an incredible insight. And that is, Rashi said, when the pasuk says you're not able, Rashi quotes Lo tuchal, and he says, this is to make it a negative prohibition as well. Now, this concept where Rashi says this is to create a negative prohibition, Rashi says it in another 3 places close to this pasuk. It says, beware lest you bring up, beware lest you bring up your burnt offerings in every place that you see, not Yerushalayim. Says Rashi, liten lo taseh ladavar. The pasuk says, beware not to do it elsewhere, not to offer up sacrifice elsewhere. This is to make a negative prohibition. Not just is there a positive prohibition, a positive instruction, you must offer up only Yerushalayim, but beware not to offer up outside Yerushalayim your sacrifices. Number 2, be careful lest you abandon the Levi. And this, says Rashi, not just the Torah says you must include the Levi in your feasts, you're eating Yerushalayim. He says, beware not to abandon the Levi. This is liten lo taseh ladavar, to create a negative prohibition also onto this instruction. Then the third instance that Rabbi quotes, et kol hadavar shanachim mitzaveh tishma asot, everything that I've instructed you, you should be guarding and doing. The word tishmeru, you should guard, means guard not to not do it, which is a negative instruction. So, lite lo taseh laseh, all the positive instructions in this parsha, now we're told, beware not to not do them. So that's a negative commandment attached to it. If you violate, you haven't just not done it, you've also done something, you've done something you shouldn't have done. But only in this pasuk, so in those other 3 instances, Rashi says very tersely, to place a negative commandment on the thing. Here Rashi adds a few words. Rashi says like this, Ba hakatuv, the pasuk has come, liten lo taseh ladavar, to place a negative commandment on this instruction. You cannot eat your tithings, second tithings, outside Yerushalayim. The pasuk has come to place a lo taseh. That's a longer, expanded language. Says the Rebbe, we can explain that this is simply what Rashi is telling us is, in the other 3 places where there's a negative command attached to the positive, those psukim are not just to create a negative commandment attached to them. There's also other things that are taught in the language of that pasuk. So when it's talked in a beware language, he says, for example, pasuk says, beware lest you offer up your sacrifices b'chol makom asher tireh, any place that you see. So there's another, it's not just making it a negative commandment, but this words, any place that you see, tells us something. Why? Because Rashi comments, asher ya'aleh b'libcha, any place you see and choose in your own volition, from your own heart. Rashi says, but if a prophet tells you to bring up a sacrifice, like Eliyahu on the Mount Carmel, then yes, you do it. So there's something else the pasuk is telling you. It's not just the pasuk comes simply to add a negative commandment. In the other instant we brought, which is beware lest you abandon the Levi. There's other words that are added there, not just that makes it a negative. All the days on your land. But from this we derive a chidush. When you're in the diaspora, there's no special instruction to take care of the Levi. That's very relevant to us. So the pasuk didn't just come to place a negative on not abandoning the Levi. That pasuk also had some additional novelty, some new things it was teaching us. The third instance we brought, et kol hadavar, that about all the positive commands, all these things that I've taught you, tishma, you should beware, lasot, to do. The Torah also says something else integral and critical. Don't add to the mitzvahs, don't decrease on the mitzvahs. So there's not just that the pasuk only came to give a negative commandment to it. There's other things the pasuk came from. Here in our pasuk, Rashi says the whole purpose of this pasuk is to make this a negative commandment as well. Not just it tells us you must eat in Yerushalayim, like we've been taught earlier. No, you cannot eat it anywhere else. Ah, 1 second. So why only over here does the pasuk come just for that reason? So it must mean makes sense to say that here we need to have this negative injunction inserted here. Not like in the other places where it's just to add stringency, to add a punishment that you're also violating, not just you're violating a to-do mitzvah, you're also violating a transgression. No, here there's a special emphasis. There needs to be a special emphasis. The pasuk comes to tell us that there's a negative commandment associated with you shall not eat your second tithings in your own cities without coming to Yerushalayim. What could this mean? Paragraph 6, you say the explanation is here the Torah is talking about tithing and about things that belong, that are holy. Eating them is a mitzvah. It's not just stop. Eating the second tithing is a mitzvah. You've separated it for Hashem. Eating it, or eating a carbon, eating your firstborn animal is a mitzvah. So you may think, when you're just coming from a simple position, that the fact that there is an instruction to bring these things and eat into Yerushalayim, that is an additional mitzvah. You have a mitzvah to eat these things. And additionally, don't just, you know where you should be eating it? In Yerushalayim. In other words, a person may come to say, mistakenly, that there's two mitzvahs. And each mitzvah is interdependent, not dependent on the other. There's a mitzvah to eat the second tithing and to eat the holy things that you need to eat. And there's a mitzvah to eat them in the place that Hashem chose in Yerushalayim. And therefore, I mean, if that's where you have to eat it, so what's the difference if it's two mitzvahs or one? No. Because what happens if somebody has extenuating circumstances? He's not able to go to Yerushalayim. It's not because of him. Hashem's taken away that opportunity from him. So maybe there would be room to say, at least a person may entertain this thought, that he's able to, and maybe even he should eat it in his place. At least do the mitzvah of eating those things that he's separated for Hashem, eat them mindfully with an intention for Hashem. So that's why Rashi says, no, don't make that mistake. It's not just additional. It's not just another mitzvah. There's a mitzvah of eating it, a mitzvah of eating in Yerushalayim. No. Hashem has come, and in this barkos, this whole pasuk comes to place a negative commandment on the matter. That not that eating Yerushalayim is an additional mitzvah. No, you're not allowed to eat it outside Yerushalayim. That's a prohibition. That's a transgression. Now Rashi continues and says, now that we understand that this whole pasuk is coming to place a negative commandment into this prohibition, 1 second. Now when it says you're not able, you know what it means? You're able, but you're not allowed. Because now that you know that there's a prohibition, now you understand why the Torah uses the language you're not able. Because we've already told you before. When Rashi says you're able, it doesn't just mean physically able. You're able to take that second tithing, which you're only allowed to eat in Yerushalayim, that you're able, doesn't mean you're able to physically unpack it and eat it. No. He says you would think that you're able conceptually to eat it in your city because there's a separate mitzvah of eating these tithes. There's a mitzvah to eat it, a mitzvah to eat in Yerushalayim. You may think that you're able to eat them here also, but the Hashem says, eat them in Yerushalayim. So the pasuk comes here and says, you're not able, you're not allowed. In other words, this conceptual possibility of eating it somewhere else, so the pasuk here has come to tell you you're not allowed to. There's no mitzvah of eating, tithing, and kachim outside Yerushalayim. It's not that there's a mitzvah and it's a mitzvah to do Yerushalayim. Outside Yerushalayim, it's not a mitzvah. You think you're able, but you shouldn't. No, you're not able because that's absolutely not a mitzvah. In this case, you think you're able to do part of the mitzvah, but you're not allowed to because you have to Yerushalayim. No, you're not even allowed to do any of it outside Yerushalayim. It's not at all a mitzvah. According to this, we'll understand why Rashi brings the example from the Yevusites. What is the Yevusites? What's the similarity to this particular verse? You're not allowed to eat the tithing outside Yerushalayim. In order to conquer the Yevusites that lived in Yerushalayim, it would seem to be that there is a mitzvah to do that. Because we have a mitzvah when we go into Israel, dispossess, get rid of all of the people living in the land. And you shall live there and you shall inherit the land yourself. So you would think that maybe it's not that you're able to dispossess the Yevusites from your physical strength. You may say, you have the ability, even conceptually, from the instruction of Hashem, to do that. He says, no, 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 you're not able because there's a promise that has been made. Because you're not allowed to, that means you're not able to. That whole instruction of inheriting the whole, dispossessing any of the nations, all the nations of Israel, does not apply here. This not being allowed to makes you unable to fulfill what seems to be an instruction from Hashem. Because there's this promise. And because of this promise, when Hashem told you, dispossess all the nations, it lechatchila did not apply to the Yevusites, upon which there was already a commitment. Just like we're saying here, that when it says you're not allowed to eat outside Yerushalayim any of these tithings, what it's telling you is that the mitzvah of eating the holy things doesn't apply in your gates. L'chatchila doesn't apply there. So now we see a correlation. You're not able, Rashi points it out here because you would think maybe there is maybe there is something good about this as well. No. It says you're not allowed to, therefore you're not able to even entertain that there's an aspect here that is possible. Paragraph 7. But l'chayra, seemingly, it's not understood. How can we say that because there's a promise made to the children of Ches, that's why the instruction of Hashem to conquer the entire Eretz Yisrael doesn't apply? Shouldn't it be that at Matan Torah, if there's Hashem gave the Torah, the time of Avraham, the commitment he made as an inspired commitment, but then comes Hashem in the Torah and gives us a mitzvah to drive everybody out of Israel. That should override it, right? So the explanation is, even though according to the strict law, the promise had no longer had any power, because Hashem had clearly overridden it. He said, you have to drive everybody out. Nonetheless, the Yevusites, in their eyes, it did have a power. There was a commitment made. So the fact that the Yidden would come in and say, well, we know that Hashem overrode that, that's fine for the Jews that believe in Hashem and that we're at the presence of the Torah and so on. But from the Yevusites' perspective, it's a chil Hashem. It's a desecration of Hashem's name. The Jews are not keeping their word. And that's why Rashi says, when it says they're not able to dispossess them, it means they're not allowed. Because there's something else that's stopping them, and that is the concept of Chil Hashem, desecrating Hashem's name. That's why the Jews have to act as if the promise does have validity. Like we find, similarly by the Gibeonites, that once there was a covenant to keep them alive, and there was a promise, and that's why Bnei Yisrael were not able to do that, even though really the promise they made to the Gibeonites didn't apply because they fooled the Jews. But they didn't kill them because for the sanctification of Hashem's name, it looked outwardly like they had made a pact. And that's why Rashi explains that the promise is not the promise of Avram to Avimelech, but rather there must have been, as Pirkei Rebbe Lezer says, there was a pact that was made when he bought the double cave. Because that highlights how much of a chilul Hashem, how much of a desecration of Hashem's name it would have been if they would have violated that pact. Why? Because the fact that they made a pact with the children of Ches, so the not conquering Yerushalayim is a stipulation in the buying of the burial cave, which would mean that if they break that part of the deal, and they now take Yerushalayim, conquer Yerushalayim, the way it looks in the eyes of the Yevusites, the Hittites, is, hang on one second. Now, if you're rolling back on that pact, then the whole deal rolls back. And now, God forbid, our forefathers are in a place that doesn't belong to them. And by the way, that Rebbe says in R62. And maybe that would mean that the whole ownership of the Bnei Yisrael on Eretz Yisrael is problematic because the first place that we as Jews inherited in Israel was a place that was done by design. Hashem wanted us to buy it, so nobody could ever have any question about it. We bought it. So if you're saying now that you're going to conquer Yerushalayim, renege, at least in the eyes of the Hittites, on that deal, then God forbid they're buried in it's a very big thing for somebody to be buried in their own burial land, not God forbid to be in stolen land. And the whole ownership of Yerushalayim is to Israel, which started with the purchase. You're saying that purchase is not valid. And in order to get rid of that desecration of Hashem's name, because we know that Hashem overrode that. So that's why they weren't able to drive them out. That's why they bought. Paragraph 8. Rashi can't just leave it at that because the 5-year-old will ask, 1 second, if there's a desecration of Hashem's name, so how did they, in the end of the day, conquer Yerushalayim? How did they drive them out? That's why Rashi brings the continuation. To answer this question, he says, you can only drive them out once you get rid of the tablets upon which the covenant was written. Because David HaMelech took those things upon which the details of the pact or the promise was written, and in that way, he got rid of any remnant of the memory of the promise. Because it's already 800 years approximately since that promise was made. Once you get rid of the written documentation, there's no longer any clear memory of that. Right? So, and this is what it says, only when you get rid of the things upon which it's written, then you got rid of any remnant of this pact. 1 second. However, you can get rid of the written record, but there were still Yevusites who remembered reading about this pact. Right? So what about them? Wasn't that a Chilul Hashem? Just to get rid of the written documentation, isn't it still desecration of Hashem's name to them? The Jews are not keeping their word. That's why Rashi quotes the Pirkei Rebbe Lezer, right? Because in Pirkei Rebbe Lezer, where it speaks about the pact, the promise that Avraham made about the city of Yerushalayim, the Pirkei Rebbe Lezer says another detail. Afterwards, David HaMelech purchased the city of the Yevusites for an everlasting purchase. He gave 600 shekels. And since David HaMelech bought the city of Yebus with full price, so that takes away any of they dispossessed them, but they paid for it. They bought it. They purchased it. So that takes away that question. So now, paragraph 9. So what we've said is that you're not able here means you're not allowed. You're not allowed, but it doesn't just mean you're not allowed. You're not able because you can't drive out the evil because there's a promise, unless you get rid of all the recorded evidence. Recorded evidence, but 1 second, there's a Chil Hashem, just because you got the recorded evidence. No, Rashi says, I bring it from Pirkei Rebbe Lezer. Pirkei Rebbe Lezer has a version that David HaMelech also bought Yerushalayim, so there's no question about Yerushalayim. Paragraph 9, according to this, we'll be able to understand why Rashi also brings the author of this teaching, Rabbi Shua ben Karcha. Why? Because a seasoned student could still ask, and everything we've said till now, since a Yid has the mitzvah of eating the tithing and eating the holy things, the korbanos, like the firstborn, how are you going to explain the fact that if somebody is totally unable, for reasons beyond himself, to go to Yerushalayim, you're not allowing him to partake of this mitzvah of eating the second tithing? Says Rashi, yes, I'm not allowing. You know why? Because who taught this? Rabbi Shua ben Karcha. Rabbi Shua ben Karcha is the author of the famous saying, which is, why do we say Shema Yisrael before we say V'hayam Shema? Shema Yisrael is accepting God's sovereignty. V'hayam Shema Tishma Mitzvahs means when you will listen to the mitzvahs. It says first you got to accept Hashem's sovereignty before you talk about doing His mitzvahs. Why you do the commandments of somebody? Because you've accepted them as an ultimate sovereign. So first accept Hashem, unquestionably. Now do everything He says. And this is also the explanation here. A Yid, before he listens to the mitzvah of where or not to eat the tithing, first he takes upon himself the sovereignty of Hashem. And if Hashem says you're not allowed to eat it in your cities, you can only eat it in the place where Hashem said, so that's it. That's the answer to the question. And this is the way the Rebbe explains, like suchal. So yes, we gain from this sikha, the Rebbe gave many instances why the word you're not able is used, even though it means you're not allowed, because in many contexts it's fit perfectly. The easiest one to understand, just offhand, is if the Torah already told you you're not allowed, now the Torah can the next time say you're not able. Here, excuse me, here there's even more potency to it because we say well, you're not, first of all, the Torah hasn't said before you're not allowed. Here he says the first time the Torah says it here is you're not allowed, and he says it in the language you're not able. Why would he use that language? Because here there's reason to think that you should be able to eat it elsewhere. Maybe because it's just a mitzvah to eat if there's two separate mitzvahs. So that's why he says you're not able. In other words, this whole thing becomes out of the realm of being a mitzvah. Even though you may think, similarly with the Yevusites, you're not able to conquer Yevus, even though you may think there's a mitzvah to conquer the whole Israel. There's a pact, and therefore there should be a discretion of Hashem's name. So that's why this language is used. You're not able when it really means you're not allowed. This is the sikha, the way at least I was able to understand it.